Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Biodiversity webinar. Up next, we have Nancy, Lamia, and Jean Muntz. Did I pronounce that correct, Jean?
Muntz.
Muntz, Jean Muntz. And they are citizen scientists from Elgin, and they're going to talk to us about a program called Start in Your Yard. Thank you, ladies, for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Frankie. We're really happy to be here. And hi, everyone. What a pleasure getting to talk to you young people about our passion for wildness. Wildness, what is it? Where does it belong? In our houses, in our yards or common areas, in our neighborhoods, in our towns, our cities, our country, in our world? Where is it okay to be wild? Well, I represent an organization called Wild Ones, so you may not be surprised to hear that I believe it's natural for us humans to live with wildness. And when we don't, it causes lots of problems, both for us and for the naturally wild world that we cut, hammer, pave, and otherwise force to be other than what it likes to be. Where we live now in our neighborhoods, in towns and cities, there used to be cornfields. But before the land was plowed for farms, there were prairies, woodlands, forests, and wetlands. There was abundant wildness, land full of life, plants and animals, birds and trees, animals so tiny you couldn't see them, and bison so big that large herds running across the prairie shook the earth. Today, we have replaced the habitats that teemed with the wildness of life. We've installed lawns and cement. We've introduced plants from lots of other countries, newcomers that don't know how to cooperate with the plants that grew up here. We've created our idea of a pretty outdoor picture. We've replaced live habitat that nurtures wildness, that brims with life, life and more life, with this dead-like picture of nature that supports almost no life at all. But now, the wildness we've tried to banish from our lives is making itself known in ways that have gotten our attention. For instance, this week in the United States, the southern state of Texas has been hit by cold temperatures that have knocked out much of their electricity. This is a current example of how storms and extreme weather are disturbing the way of life we've come to expect and to depend on. As our earth warms, weather and storms get more frequent and extreme. Humans are beginning to ask, what can we do to get back to the more balanced world that we took for granted? Maybe you think about these things yourself. There are lots of ideas about what we can do to get ourselves out of this pickle. We picked one that makes a huge difference. It's not fancy, and it's something we can do without getting permission. We don't have to demonstrate to get laws changed. We don't have to apply for a permit. We can invite wildness into our own yard. We can start in our yard right away. So we call our solution Start in Your Yard. Start in Your Yard wants to wake people up to the idea that wild is good. It's healthy, and it can teach us to be wise if we're willing to listen. Now, most people have no experience with coaxing wildness into their yards and neighborhoods. We've done without wildness for so long, we think we don't need it. In fact, we've tried to make our outdoors more like our indoors, with neat and tidy lawns, free of anything that annoys us, predictable, perfect, we think, for us and our human friends. But we're discovering that living without wildness is not healthy for us. We're beginning to understand that as we got neater and neater in our neighborhoods, we got rid of things we didn't understand, things that would keep our water clear and healthy, that would keep our air safe to breathe, that would shelter and feed insects and plants, the very organisms that we can't live without, insects and plants. Can you make lunch using only air, water, and sunshine? That's what our plants do. It's their superpower. One person who's helped us understand what I've been telling you is Dr. Doug Tallamy. He's an entomologist, studies insects, bugs, and he's written a book called Nature's Best Hope. In his book, he explains why we need wildness in our yards. Then he gives us an idea for how to do it. Replace half of our grassy lawn with native plants. Now you might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound like much. That can't be very important. That can't make much of a difference. But he points out that we have 40 million acres of lawn in our country. If you and I and everyone else were to make this change, it would create 20 million acres of habitat, 20 million acres of food for hungry critters. We'd create the largest national park in our country, bigger than our 13 largest national parks, including Yellowstone, Denali, the Tetons, the Grand Canyon, the Everglades, Yosemite, and the Smoky Mountains, all combined. So Start in Your Yard asks, how can we turn people on to the fun of living with wildness right outside our doors? Living in the homegrown national park we'll help to create. What can we coax back into our neighborhoods to live with us? So that when we go outside, there's always something really interesting to see if we look, just like in a national park. Now, most people haven't tried to persuade wildness to return to their yards, so there's a lot to learn about how to do it. We're just at the beginning. Everybody who signs up for Start in Your Yard will be trying out ideas to see what happens. And we like this way of approaching the problems we face. We like it much better than worrying, feeling overwhelmed by what's happening and deciding, there's nothing I can do because I'm just one person. There is something I can do, something powerful and important. I can walk out my door, grab my spade or shovel, and begin making changes that invite wildness to join me. By planting native plants and learning to use the techniques nature uses, I can do something very important. Now, finally, I want to tell you about one very big thing we've learned from Dr. Tallamy and his research. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they've developed ways to survive the insects that want to eat them. And they're very successful. Some are tough to chew, some smell or taste really bad, some makes whoever eats them sick. They have lots of strategies. But over thousands of years, particular insects have learned to eat certain plants. Many insects have adapted to eating only one kind of plant. They're called specialists. And the monarch butterfly is a famous example. Monarch caterpillars are specialists. They eat only milkweed. Without milkweed to lay their eggs on, monarchs are doomed. By contrast, People regarded these wild plants, milkweed, as weeds. It's right in the name. And so they thought it was okay to get rid of them. What happened? The monarchs began to disappear too. Why? Monarchs must have milkweed to feed their caterpillars. So as it disappeared, so too did the monarchs. Now, there are insects that can eat more than just one family of plants, and they're called generalists. These insects can use a variety of food sources, up to as many as, wait, how many do you think I'm going to say? 100? 50? 10? 1,000? No, the most general generalists can feed on no more than 4 plant families. Even our generalists are very specialized. Insects can't eat just any old plant. So without the kind of plant it can eat, an insect is doomed because it takes a very long time, way more than hundreds of years, for an insect species to adapt itself, to change enough that it can feed on a different kind of plant. Our birds must have insects to survive. Insects must have plants they can eat, but they can't eat the grass in our lawns. They can't eat plants that we brought in from far away. And in most of our yards, that's all there is. A grassy lawn with some plants, shrubs, and trees that developed with other insects in another part of the world. Start in your yard encourages people to plant the plants that feed the insects, that feed the birds, and bring wildness back into our yards, back into our lives. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to pass the baton to Jean Muntz, who will be making the second part of this presentation. She and I have been having a great time talking to people about the Start in Your Yard ideas, these ideas, imagining what our towns will look like with wildness, feeling how it will feel to live with wildness. And I'm inviting you to do the same. If you haven't yet discovered for yourself the power of your imagination, of imagining something into being, I'm hoping you'll try it out. Whenever we create something in the physical world, we first imagine it and feel the happiness of it. We have mental pictures, lively, creative conversations with friends, and we imagine it so strongly that it's almost as if it already exists, and it does in our hearts and minds. As you think about the kind of world you want to live in, let your heart lead you to a fabulous vision. Then you can discover what you need to learn and how you want to apply it. Okay, how you want to apply it to create the world you know is possible. That's the very most important thing, and I almost didn't get it said. You'll learn how to create the kind of world that you know is possible. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Jean Muntz is going to talk in more detail about Dr. Ptolemy's ideas and use the word we usually use instead of wildness, nature. Jean?
Hi, everyone. Carrying on with what Nancy's introduced already, I too am a member of the Wild Ones of Northern King County. And one of the most frequently used words we use is nature. I'm having trouble getting, there we go. And in this slide, you've seen where we're talking about our Start in Your Yard program. we use that little tagline, changing the nature of our impact. And here we use the word nature to indicate the way we're going to make an impact or the difference we're going to make. But let's take a moment to develop a mutual understanding about the larger concept of nature. To some, too many really, nature is something separate from us, something that exists out there, somewhere else, the public park, the forest preserve, the lakeshore, Yosemite. But it might be more accurately explained the following way, quote, nature is not a place to visit, it is home. Or how about this thought from Andy Goldsworthy, who's an artist, a sculptor, an environmentalist. Quote, we often forget that we are nature. Nature's not something separate from us. So when we say that we have lost our connection to nature, we've lost our connection to ourselves. In other words, we humans, animals, birds, plants, and even insects are all interconnected. And what we do to the environment, ultimately, we do to ourselves, our home. Today, we highlight some thought-provoking ideas from the book Nancy showed you, Bringing Nature Home, an approach to nature that starts in your yard by Dr. Douglas Tallamy. Biological wasteland is the term Dr. Tallamy suggests best describes our biologically barren lawn. In his book, he declares that every square foot dedicated to lawn is a square foot degrading our local ecosystem. Here we see an example of what is known as a monoculture crop, someone's beloved lawn. To maintain such a monoculture lawn that looks like this requires an immense investment of time, energy, water, and chemicals. And when it rains here, the grass is unable to absorb most of it, 75% of it. And it becomes runoff into our neighborhood sewers, eventually into the Fox River, if we're in the Elgin area, and on. What we do in our yards here goes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Here's a map of the watersheds of Illinois. And so you see encircled our area up around Kane County, Cook County, and the purple line follows the Fox River down to Morris, Illinois, where it joins the Illinois River, and then down to a point very close to the city of St. Louis, Missouri. And that's where it dumps into the Mississippi and goes all the way to the Gulf. At the same time, even all the attention this grass is given, the soil beneath the grass becomes depleted. Is this not concerning? Especially when we read that Dr. Tallamy exists, that the average residential lot is 80 to 90% turf grass or lawn. It's a big, heavy mat. Thankfully, he is able to suggest that common sense approach to address his concern, and that is to replace some of our grass with native plants to this area. Well, what makes native plants the right choice? Nancy talked a little bit about that. Native plants, trees, and shrubs, those that were already here when the European settlers arrived, have co-evolved with the other plants, trees, shrubs, insects, birds, animals, soil, climate, water, longitude, latitude of a given area. And because of that, the native plants are the components in the life support system, or our ecosystem, that produces our clean air and clean water. You know the story of the monarch butterfly, whose larva, caterpillar, can only eat our native milkweed. Well, this kind of specialist relationship, insect with plant, is true for 90% of our native insects. And on this slide, this is a website that Dr. Ptolemy has designed that anyone can go to. They can enter their zip code, and what comes up are the photos of plants that are native to this area, but not just that. Down in the lower right-hand corner of each photo, you see a number and a little butterfly. Well, he is telling us on this website exactly how many caterpillars or Lepidoptera butterflies are supported by that particular plant. So look at strawberry, 64 different species of Lepidoptera caterpillar butterflies are supported by that little strawberry. And right below it, the violet, you see, it has a rating of 28. It will support 28 caterpillars, different species of caterpillars. Some of the photos are missing as yet because they're just putting this website up and developing it. And here's the oak tree and the ginkgo tree, both very popular trees. But you see the oak, whom we call the king of our ecosystem, hosts 532 species of Lepidoptera or caterpillar butterflies. Whereas the ginkgo, which has been imported here from Asia, hosts 5 species of Lepidoptera in our ecosystem. Now, back in Asia, this is a native plant. The ginkgo is a native and does a far better service to that ecosystem. So we can begin to conclude that all plants are not equal when it comes to the role they play in a given ecosystem. If they're not native and they've been introduced, in essence, they steal from a native the location, the nutrients, the sun's energy, and then they fail to fulfill a meaningful role in that ecosystem. If no controls or predators exist to keep their numbers down, they may go rogue and become invasive. Dr. Ptolemy suggests we think of invasive plants as ecological tumors that spread unchecked in our local ecosystem, inhibiting its ability to function. Decades ago, Aldo Leopold, a biologist and naturalist from nearby Wisconsin, explained it all so brilliantly. He tells us land then is not merely soil, it is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. So I'm going to refer to this as a biodynamic engine that powers our ecosystem. And it will start in your yard when you plant natives. Love this chart. Way over on the far left is our beloved lawn. That is a side view of what grass and its roots do. Whereas way over on the right side is something called buffalo grass. That is a native grass. And look at what those roots are able to do in the soil. Well, once it's initiated, this biodynamic engine I'm talking about becomes its own regenerating system. You can see it sends down deep roots that biodrill compacted soil 4 to 16 feet in some cases. They anchor, they add nutrients and remove pollutants. They participate in vast networks of communication and nutrient exchange with fungi and bacteria. Now, this vast network of fungi is not on the diagram. It's microscopic, but it is referred to as the Earth's internet because it is so vast. These roots also search for water, control erosion, sequester carbon, replenish groundwater. Meanwhile, their leaves are the solar collectors, capturing the sun's energy, passing it into the food web through insects, birds, animals, and the circuit continues as any waste generated by this system becomes food. Once you have the key, you could start in your yard this biodynamic engine just by planting some natives. Now, here's our challenge with this new approach. Can we change our standard of beauty from one of an expansive, manicured, mowed, monoculture crop of grass to a yard that we could describe as filled with birdsong, buzzing with bees, swaying in the breeze, humming with activity, teeming with life? All these descriptions are evidence that we're reconnecting to that biodynamic engine, and it is at work. It contains mysterious, integrated, dynamic relationships. Here's a chart of 10 of the most well-known butterflies on the left, and on the far right is their caterpillar. In the middle is the plant that they are specialized to. So that caterpillar needs that plant in the middle to eventually become a butterfly. Now, once they're a butterfly, they can nectar on a number of plants, but that butterfly will need the host plant to lay her eggs, and the cycle begins again for the caterpillar to be born and eat upon that plant. This garden I'm talking about attracts enough bees and butterflies and moths to pollinate flowers and crops. It restores groundwater and sequesters carbon. It removes toxins. It keeps numbers in check, and food for many. Now, these are chickadees. On the left is mom. She's carrying, I think, 2 caterpillars in her beak, which she considers nutrient-dense bags of baby bird food back to the nest. And there she's going to plunge it down the throat of one of her nestlings, maybe 2 of her nestlings, if I'm right about 2 caterpillars. Whereas on the right, we have Dad with an older fledgling now who's out of the nest. So he's able to move to the junior bird food, which will consist of the crackly beetles and a seed like Father is giving him here. Dr. Ptolemy has actually counted how many caterpillars Mom and Dad chickadee need to feed 1 clutch of nestlings. It's thousands for a clutch of 3 to 4. And his research reveals that caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other plant eater. Explains why Dr. Ptolemy is so interested in caterpillars. And here's the clincher. With this plant, animal, and insect diversity that you're going to create, The land becomes resilient, able to mitigate, let's use the word heal, able to heal the effects of ecological damage. And we reconnect to this integrated and energetic system that has always been there. Many suggest it even performs services we don't yet understand because it is amazing, astonishing, and beautiful. It requires no mowing, no extra water, and no fertilizer. Think of it. With a simple system decision to replace some of our grass with natives, we generate a system that does all that. And when we become a part of the ecosystem, rather than living apart from it, we participate with nature and steward a yard we understand is shared with many creatures. Each yard is a piece in a great mosaic or a patch in the neighborhood quilt. Researchers tell us gardening can be an antidepressant, and even brief exposures to the natural world will produce measurable medical and social benefits. We can care about something, but the real work of the world is to care for it. Healing will come not by minimizing our impact, but by changing the nature of our impact. Native gardens have much to teach. Universal wisdom, like what we save saves us, what we appreciate appreciates. The native plants will show us what we do to heal our yards is an act of reciprocity, of giving back, saying thanks for the gifts the plants, animals, and insects give us. And the earth will reciprocate with an increased ability to draw down carbon and create more resilient land right where we live. Just start in your yard.
Thank you very much, ladies. Hopefully everybody has learned a lot from your presentation. We have some questions here. The first one is, are there landscapes in our area that focus on native plants? I intend to make my yard nature friendly in the spring.
And you're looking for landscapers to help to do that, I believe. We actually have a list of people who are interested in native plants and do their landscaping with native plants. So go to startinyouryard.com, and it's not up there yet, but I'm thinking by next week that should be out there, and you can actually download a list of companies that can come and help with the physical work of making this kind of change.
And if you want to see an example of native plants being reintroduced into an area that had been taken over by invasives, the Hawthorne Hill Nature Center, which is right near the intersection of Route 20 and Randall Road. Some of us are in the midst of doing work out there to help reclaim what was there originally. And several gardens have been introduced that are native, using native plants only. There's a native pollinator garden, and there's a native rain garden there. And there's hiking trails which take you into a wooded area because that area was an oak savanna originally when the founders of Elgin arrived here. And so that's an easy one to get to if you're in the Elgin area.
And another one that's very accessible is the prairie at Sherman Hospital, right there at Big Timber Road and Randall Road. Gina and I just walked it a couple of months ago, and it's amazing what they've done there, what they're doing there. Actually, the day we were there, they were out harvesting seeds to, well, I'm not sure whether they were going to other places where they are doing restoration or maybe still being spread there at the Sherman Prairie.
Mhm.
Also, at startinyouryard.com, and it's not out there yet, but just to give you a little tip off, eventually there's going to be, what are we calling it? A patchwork of progress, where you'll be able to see pictures and little quips about what people are doing at various locations in Elgin. So we're picturing the day when it's going to be very easy to find a landscaper who helps and see the kind of things that other people are doing and get ideas.
Okay, Jacqueline asks, are there plants that are actually harmful to the biodiversity in our ecosystem? What should we avoid planting?
Well, some of those are the invasives that are the most common in this area. Buckthorn is one, and honeysuckle is one. Honeysuckle is a bush that puts out red berries in the fall, and the birds go to those red berries thinking, ooh, yum, yum, it's a red berry. But because it's an invasive, it's been introduced from another ecosystem, it's not a healthy berry for our birds. It's one that's very high in sugar. It's one that causes them to leave deposits rather quickly after they eat it. It would be like us drinking a bunch of Coca-Cola all day long. Whereas the native shrubs that are part of our ecosystem have berries as well, but those berries are very high in fat because in the fall, a lot of the animals and birds that would be attracted to those berries need the fat storage for migration, and they need it, if they're staying here, they need it for winter. But one of the things both those plants do is create a chemical change in the soil that inhibits other plants from growing there. It's called allelopathic when they do that process. And so getting rid of those non-natives is a real helpful thing to do. To begin to put natives in for those reasons I've mentioned already.
When we moved to our house, it had a huge buckthorn hedge, and I must confess that it's part of what drew me to buy the house, because it was such a nice privacy screen. But as I learned, I started birding, and as I learned about what birds need and how harmful buckthorn is, we took that hedge out. And I had noticed before, we had visited, I think it was the Botanic Garden, where they had a big bottle brush buckeye, and I had a bottle brush buckeye, but it just didn't do much. And the one at the garden was just huge and gorgeous. Well, once we took down the buckthorn hedge, here came my bottle brush buckeye. It didn't have to fend off those enzymes in the soil from the buckthorn, and it has just become this gorgeous bush. And it's my most dramatic story of what the buckthorn does to the biodiversity of the plants in your yard. Not to mention what Jean was talking about, their berries are not good for the birds. They just pass right through them without leaving much nutrition in their wake.
Well, and I have to admit something that I did unwittingly years back. I live on a property that was a pasture at one point, and in order to bring that pasture into more, I just felt it needed, to establish shrubs and trees and things. I ordered from a legitimate source materials that were touted as they would be good for, bringing back pasture land. Well, it turned out it was multiflora rose, and which is an invasive, and it was also the honeysuckle I was talking about earlier. So I actually brought it into my property and planted it. And it wasn't for, a year, probably a decade after that, that I found out what I had really done. And by then, it's still on my property, and that was years ago. So I still battle that issue, but that's how we learn. That has been part of my evolution to coming to be have the focus on native plants and being a native plant gardener.
And I think all of us have stories like that, because at the time that we were doing this planting, well, I don't know how much information was available, but I didn't have the information. And so I am still, like Jean, cleaning up things that, oh my goodness, they seemed like such a good idea at the time. And come to find out, I mean, yeah, well, I won't tell you the horrors of what I'm still chasing down, like Jean's saying. But part of what we're offering is the opportunity to not do what we did. So I recommend now learning about natives first before you make big decisions about where you're living.
Well, and I would just add that being a gardener is a humbling experience because we have to be able to admit that we've done these things, but we've learned from them. And so that's not embarrassing. We've learned something new. Let's be proud of that and apply it. So it has a way of bringing us down to understanding that we are collaborating with Mother Nature, or however you want to say it, that we are collaborators. We are not the dominant species in our yard. We're collaborators.
Well, and in the interest of telling you about a technique that is absolutely wonderful for converting lawn to native plants, we call it smothering. And my story, well, it's funny now. It wasn't so funny at the time, but I planted, we had this bed we were so proud of winter creeper, which is just a ghastly thing to plant here. It just has so many reasons not to plant it. Well, anyway, this was a large bed under a tree. It was, to my eye at that time, it was quite beautiful. Well, anyway, as I started to make changes, I knew this winter creeper was going to be tough, but I had this vision of this shade bed with a bench and so forth. So I got black plastic and covered this winter creeper, covered it in the fall, thinking, oftentimes you can cover it and smother it. And over the winter, by spring, you can just dig right through. If you've covered it with cardboard and sand and mulch, you can just dig right through it and do your planting. It does a great job of smothering. But I got to tell you, with this winter creeper, I went out there in the spring and I picked up the black plastic to look underneath, and it was like these little guys going, "Hi there." I know we're not green, but we are still perfectly. Yeah, it has taken a long time and I'm still working on it, but I've made a lot of progress. But it does tell you that a really good technique for changing whatever it is that you want to get rid of is to smother it and then plant right through it, because not everything, but most things, with a good layer of cardboard or newspaper, put some sand on it to hold it down, cover it with mulch or leaves. And then in a few months or in the spring, however you time it, you can honestly just, I was absolutely stunned. I had read about it. And then when I did it, it was like, oh my gosh, it's really true.
It's important for you to know that Jean and Nancy would be considered citizen scientists. So they weren't formally trained in this area, but through investigation, trial and error, and research, they've gained great information that they now share with people.
Well, in Wild Ones, the Native Plants Organization, we both showed slides of it, has just been so key. There are such incredibly knowledgeable people in that group. And why native gardeners are just always happy to share what they know, what they've learned. So I know I have profited immensely, and I'm sure Jean would say the same, from the Wild Ones organization.
Well, and
Probably like a group. Oh, sorry.
we've really enjoyed the two books that Doug Tolomei has written. He wrote one before this called Bringing Nature Home, with some of the same messages, and the way he connects the dots for this whole system that we understand exists. And now we just got word that his new book is coming out, which will be all on oak trees. So we're looking forward to that too.
End of March, it's due out. And
So-
you were going to say, Frankie?
Oh, Evan has a question for you, and he is asking, what is the best flower to help the environment?
Well,
You know
I think one of the best ways to look at that is the idea that it's the plant that bears that flower, and what it can do in the ecosystem, in our ecosystem here in the Midwest. And I would refer you back to that one chart that was showing photographs of native plants, and they're ranked in their ability to perform in the ecosystem by that little number I was showing you that's next to the butterfly. So Doug Tolomei calls those the keystone plants. So there are 5 or 6, only 5 or 6 that are considered the keystone plants for our Midwestern ecosystem here. And the oak is number 1 because of, you know, we've shown you what the oak supports.
And
So I'd look at that it's a national website you can look at.
do you remember the address, Jean?
It's
NRWF?
yeah, the National Wildlife Federation National Wildlife Federation .org
Yeah.
/plant finder.
Or if you just Google plant finder from and wildlife, you're going to bring it up. And Audubon also has a plant finder site that is interestingly set up, well, you would guess this, on what kind of birds you want to attract to your yard. So you can look up the Audubon plant finder, enter the kind of your zip code and the kind of bird that you want to attract, and that will help. Now, some of the most, the keystone plants, you were asking about flowers, some of the most helpful flowers are the goldenrods, common plants in our area, and the asters. And of course, these are summer and fall bloomers. Jean, can you think of?
Yeah, the black-eyed Susan.
Yes.
Is one, and milkweed is one. And I know there's another one, I'm just not thinking of it, but it's I think it was Evan's question also brings up an interesting concept, and that is that native plants like to appear in community. All the plants have communities of other plants they prefer to have around them. And so they arrange themselves that way out in the wild. And we are well served if we can start to understand what the community of plants, what other plants the coneflower wants to have around itself, because they will organize themselves that way.
Despite what the gardener says.
Yeah, just
But I did want to also make the point that, when you think about goldenrod, it's very easy to think of it as just a weed, just something that you want to get rid of. And I think it's important to realize that things that are common, we can overlook their importance in the landscape that we are looking to build because of the value that is added. And so it's easy to overlook the fact that goldenrod is such a productive plant in our ecosystems, and asters the same way. So you have to look past it. We were talking this morning about the fact that it's us who have to change. We have to change the way we think about things and the way we view things. And this is one of the things to change in our minds, that just because it's common doesn't mean that we don't want it in our yards. And goldenrod has so many different kinds of plants, low ones, high ones, ones that grow aggressively, some that are much more subdued. So there are lots of ways to plant goldenrod depending on your needs on your property.
well, and one other thing I'd like to say about goldenrod, and that is there's a myth surrounding goldenrod that it is responsible for allergies, that people have allergies, pollen allergies because of goldenrod. And that can't be true, because goldenrod is pollinated by insects. It's not pollinated by blowing it in the wind. So there are different ways. A lot of the natives are pollinated by their insect friends, or Doug has us thinking about some of the insects that do this work in our garden are like little fairy helpers in the garden. They're the garden fairies doing the work.
Thank you very much for the response to Evan. There was another question that's very much similar to that, and I think you already responded to it. So what's the best plants for animals? And so I think you responded to that as well as you were going through your answer. Jacqueline has a question.
I would mention that there is a site, IllinoisWildflowers.info, that at the end of its article on each of the plants talks about what insects and animals feed on that plant. So it's possible to look up particular plants, particular animals and insects, and see precisely who eats what.
Now, Jacqueline is asking, is there a website we can go to know what was originally on our property that was natural?
Oh, that's a great question. I think someone needs to develop that if it doesn't exist already. I think that's really neat. And also our county forest preserve system has done assessments, and they've done an inventory of oaks. We are we're in the country, part of the country there were many oak savannas here, and they have done an inventory to find and image the oaks that still might be in existence. We've lost from the original oaks that were here when Illinois was first settled, we're down to only 17% of oaks remaining in what was here in Illinois originally.
Wow.
I think too that some of the people who work in restoration do have maps of what was here when. I don't happen, that's not where I've concentrated, so I can't give you any references off the top of my head, but I know that you can find that kind of thing. Yes, and Debbie's just putting in the Plant ID book by Dick Young. And there's also Flora of the Chicago region by Wilhelm and
Oh, no, yeah,
yeah,
Barry Wilhelm, and I can't remember his partner's
yeah,
name.
I can't either. But